Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining me for this week's edition of the SMIE Consulting Midweek Roundup. It's Wednesday, September 4th, 2024, and today we're going to be answering 3 questions we've been hearing from international educators over the last 7 days. And actually, this is my first roundup in about 3 weeks due to some travel obligations in South Asia. Had the pleasure of visiting Nepal, India, and Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka for the first time in my 31-year career, the 80th country that I've had the pleasure of visiting for recruitment purposes. So very excited about some of the outcomes from that trip. I'll talk through some of that as we go through today's roundup topics. But as we do each time we do a midweek roundup, we start with our newsletter that comes out Monday mornings at about 9 Eastern. If you subscribe via our website, smieconsulting.org/subscribe, you can sign up that way if you prefer an email version of the roundup or of our newsletter that comes out on Monday morning. If you prefer to get your international ed news from LinkedIn, there's also a version of that. I'll drop the link to that in the chat as well. Between the two versions, the email and the LinkedIn version, we now have well over 2,000 subscribers. Very excited about how broad the reach of that newsletter has become in the international ed space, and thank you for making it a part of your international edification each week. And as we mentioned, we take those news stories from the newsletter in terms of the common themes we see developing around different topics related to international education. Then we cover the questions coming out of those themes here on the Roundup on Wednesdays. And this is obviously live on our social platforms on Facebook and LinkedIn and YouTube, but certainly you can also get the audio-only version or watch this on repeat as well. Audio-only version is available on all your major podcast providers, so you can listen while you work out, or take a walk. So hopefully you are glad you're making the Midweek Roundup also part of your news gathering each week. And that's the main purpose of the Roundup and the newsletter, is to kind of help share in half-hour doses here on the Roundup, in a 5-10 minute read on the newsletter on Mondays, kind of our hot takes on what's going on in the newsletter on those top stories, but here on Wednesdays, diving a little deeper into how some of these topics we're covering and the questions we're asking, how that might impact what we do in international ed in a more positive manner. So let's get right into our first question of the day. What are we to make of the U.S. student visa process now? The reason this topic comes up is from my recent trip to South Asia. Visa access to appointments certainly was top of the list, and then followed closely by visa denials that have been up this past year in each of the 3 major markets we're talking about, or at least 2 of the 3 major markets that I visited. We are now in a cycle where we're still coming out of the pandemic, post-pandemic, in terms of numbers, in terms of the demand. The demand is certainly for visa appointments is certainly well above what it was during the pandemic, and certainly in some prospects, some folks' eyes, has reached or surpassed, in certain countries, surpassed pre-pandemic levels. So the thrust of this question about what are we to make of the U.S. student visa process these days is coming out of an article that Ben Waxman shared from INTED that covered his reactions to some of particularly one of the sessions at the EdUSA Forum in DC in end of July, beginning of August, where visa denials, visa wait times, all were popular topics, and put the Bureau of Consular Affairs folks straight in the line of fire for a lot of negative comments and about the denial rates and other things that the association world in international ed is certainly addressing through the Coalition for U.S. Coalition for Success, and their associated membership organizations, and how well they are trying to impose and the demands on Bureau of Consular Affairs to re-examine how they're making visa decisions. A lot of this is important context, because our visa process is very different than our peers. We're the only ones that require that in-person interview of all visa applicants unless they have had a U.S. visa in the previous 5 years. So that in and of itself is a huge stumbling block to and limits how many visa appointments can be done in every market every year because of that physical manpower issue that has to be addressed to accommodate those needs. In some countries, they've held student visa appointments availability in particularly the last few weeks leading up to the beginning of classes at many U.S. colleges and universities. Some would say they're releasing these appointments too late. They should have been released earlier to accommodate those that are now pushed out in some countries for a full year, in Nepal in particular, for student visa appointments if you were just applying normally. So there are real implications on the visa process. But at the EdUSA Forum, there were sessions. There was a particular session with consular affairs folks that they were talking about how they're changing how they view student visa interviews, and that they shouldn't expect an 18-year-old to have their whole life planned out, or at least even what they're going to do in 5 years when they graduate in terms of coming back home and having that well thought out plan. They've impressed on their consular officers that shouldn't necessarily be. One thing that I really appreciate from the article was their perspective on student visas related to the consular officers that are doing these visa interviews. For those that aren't aware, if you're coming out of the State Department Foreign Service School, going out into the field for your first 1 or 2 posts, 90% of your job, your first couple of posts, is as a consular officer doing these interviews. 100, 200 a day for a week at a time. That wraps up the bulk of your training, or your bulk of your training and experiences in your first couple of posts is going to be with these visa appointments, in-person interviews. So Ben makes the exceptional point that I've always knew was true, and then he certainly confirmed it for me, that the bulk of the Foreign Service officers, this is their first posting, the second posting, that they're really fired up. A lot of them are recruited from the top most selective schools in the country, universities in the country, and have a fairly elite mentality. That yes, they shouldn't bring that elite mentality to their visa interview process, but it's just human nature. It happens, and rooting out that bias confirmation bias is certainly something that State Department folks have to do a better job of. That was admitted, and they know it's an area of concern. But the fact that we are in a situation where visa officers consular officers coming in doing these visa interviews are coming from elite school backgrounds and probably haven't heard of most community colleges in the United States, didn't even bother applying to any of them, but not realizing those are legitimate pathways, English language programs that are legitimate pathways to a U.S. Student visa. That those stereotypes need to be broken down. So there's things that State Department needs to do to improve how the visa process is done, but there are also things that we should do as institutions to address the kind of issues and explain to our future students as they're going through the admissions process, have gotten that I-20 and are about to start through the visa process in their home countries, is to help them understand what's going on. Certainly getting students in each country to go to Education USA consular sessions that they host every year in their different cities, where they bring in consular folks or do virtually interviews with consular folks where they explain the process on how it happens locally, in terms of making the appointment, in terms of documents you need to bring, in terms of how the interview goes and what best advice is for practice or not, versus maintaining or rehearsing a speech. All of those things are things that Education USA does, and that should be an important part of the education process with our future students as they get their I-20s with us, and what we include with what we send. Attacking that from multiple angles, certainly referring them to their local Education USA office. If their agency, if they're working with one, does visa preparation sessions, also make sure you know what those visa preparation sessions look like from your agent partners, and offer the advice after reading through this article that Ben puts in on the visa process, on the things that we need to be educating students about. We should also be doing with our agents. About what are the kinds of questions that they're going to be asked, how they need to answer them properly, why they are so important that they understand. All of that's gone through in some great detail here, and that they boil it down in the blog article from INTED to four main issues that need to be explained clearly by the student to the visa officer. The four main areas that they need to answer effectively. We know that there are three questions that every student must answer to successfully get a U.S. student visa. That is, are they a serious student? How are they going to pay for their studies? And what is their plan when they're done in some level of detail? Those are the three that State Department folks will always say those are the three thresholds, questions that need to be answered satisfactorily to that consular officer's impressions of each student applicant. So the four questions that Ben and the team at INTED have suggested we need to be explaining clearly to students that they are going to be priorities that are how and why they're selected, and how and why they selected the institution identified on their I-20, what they plan to study and why they chose that particular academic program, what they plan to do with the education once they return home. And an important part of that is return home, because they have to prove that they're not planning to immigrate to the United States, even though they technically can. How they will, and finally, how they will finance their education. So covering the basic 3 points that I mentioned as well, but talking specifically about number 1 and number 2 are combining why you chose, are you a serious student, where you can articulate why you chose the particular institution you're going to attend and why you chose the particular academic program you're going to pursue. Those are the things that we need to be communicating effectively. And why are those things important? Because the visa process is intimidating. They typically don't do a good job. Students, if they're on their own, don't really know exactly what to rely on for help, particularly if they don't know about Education USA or don't have an agent that they're working with. They're relying on you to provide this content. If they have it also from EdUSA, that's great. You know that's trusted. But if they're doing it with an agent, make sure your agents are aware locally of EdUSA, but also that they're giving the right information in terms of their prep sessions. And that the belief that U.S. education is financially out of reach, that's one of those things that consular officers have to be confident knowing that the students have the right finances to pay for their education. So great article by the INTED team as usual in terms of what students should expect. And one that makes us think about the visa process. Obviously, when we're communicating with future students, we need to be communicating, understanding what their needs are and why, how they're viewing the process, and step back and look at it from through their eyes, and acknowledge what the high stress points that they're probably enduring as they prepare for this important next to last step before they can come to you. So we'll cover this topic of student visas again at the end of in our third question, but we'll move on to question number 2, which is, have we made it back to pre-pandemic recruitment levels here in the United States? We've certainly seen numbers increase. Certainly Open Doors numbers were up last year in the 2023 report, which looked at the previous academic year, 22-23. The real-time data that we have available is through SEVIS by the numbers, through DHS. And there's a report out from Boundless that kind of analyzes the SEVIS by the numbers data and showed that by the end of 2023, there were 1.5 million F&M students living in the United States. That's a 10% increase from the previous year. Clear sign that the international student enrollment is bouncing back to pre-pandemic levels. So the 2023 numbers are the largest in SEVIS by the numbers reports since 2019, so in the year before the pandemic. So hopefully this fall, 2024, at the end of the calendar year, we'll be at a position where we'll know we're back over 2019 levels. So this Boundless report takes a look at 3 main areas of why the U.S. is back up to these pre-pandemic levels. First up, recruitment efforts. I'll quote these from the Boundless report. U.S. institutions are intensifying their effort to attract international students to counteract a drop in domestic enrollments. We know about the domestic cliff that everybody's been talking about for the last 5 or 6 years, and it's happening. And here's one of the reasons why U.S. institutions are doing to counter that, is ramping up international efforts, and we've certainly done that at UNLV. The second is global capacity. And we look at what's happening in Canada, the UK, Australia, where net migration is a huge issue in terms of governments are conservative and liberal both are reacting to the huge increases in net migration that they've experienced in the last 5 years, and as a result have imposed some significant caps and regulations that limit the number of new international students that can come into the country. Australia this week, and we'll touch about this in the third article, or third question, has just imposed 240,000 new student visas issued each year. UK has limited their dependent student visas only to doctoral level students. We've seen restrictions on our limits on the funding that or the salaries increases for international students in certain fields has limited their ability to gain employment and their post-study work with the graduate route. And in Canada, they're just finishing their first year of their first 30% reduction cap on student visas or study permits that are issued there, along with other countries. There's been some real challenges and limits that have been put in place, and as a result, part of the reason for those limits that are being put in place is that they are already at capacity. Capacity in a number of different ways. You hear about the housing challenges that international students have in these other major destinations, particularly in cities, in less populated cities or towns that they might attend in Canada, for example. That universities that have been short on funding from the federal government or provincial governments are now, or over the last few years, have been going heavy on international, perhaps too much. And as a result, the housing issues in the communities where they're located that aren't high enough, the housing stocks aren't high enough to accommodate all the need because they're at capacity or surpass capacity. There were universities in the UK a year ago that were telling international students that even though they might have visas and gotten them places in scholarship in the university, if they didn't have housing sorted, they shouldn't come. I mean, that's probably, of all things, it's probably a good thing to tell them before they get on the plane and come. They don't want that to be wasted. But they made that very clear. So the capacity issues in these other countries, because they don't have the local housing stock either on campus or in their communities. They're seeing in their local communities and at the national level the pressures these extra international students have put on resources for the government in terms of healthcare, other services that are offered, how that is negatively impacting the government's views of all these extra students. They've gone beyond capacity. And we've talked in the US, we are only at 5-6% of our higher ed population being international, whereas Canada, UK, Australia are 25-30% or more. So those limits are reasons why the new limits are being put in place are because they simply can't handle the extra volume in those countries for housing and strain on services, let alone places at the university, even though the universities still want to bring more of them in because they're encountering some real financial hardships. But in the United States, we have that capacity to grow not only percentage of our student bodies that are international, but also we're built as residential schools. The majority of our campuses are. So we have the ability to house students on campus without being too much of a strain on the local communities. So there's that capacity that's very much in our U.S. favor. And the final piece is the increase in student visa issuance. And though we've talked many times and we hear a lot in the news, all the problems with visa approval rates, particularly in Africa and other countries, we are also seeing the number of visas issued. Like in 2023, an 8.5% increase over 2022, and the most student visas issued in a single year since 2016. So probably by the end of 2024, we'll see hopefully number of visas issued for the fiscal year 2024 be at levels of 2016 or more. So some positive news coming out on the visa front that even though there have been efforts to improve capacity in terms of visa appointments in many countries, the fact that we still have the handbrake on because of our requirement for in-person visa interviews for every student who hasn't already had a U.S. visa in the last 5 years. So the Boundless report also goes into how how the number of students on OPT has also increased, a 37% increase in 2023 of students enrolling in OPT. And of those numbers, the greater majority were in the STEM fields, with India representing 39% of the OPT students and China representing 23.7%. So that's the second question of the day. Our final topic is how are student visa caps affecting where students go? Now, on my trip this past 3 weeks, 2.5 weeks, where I just got back on Monday evening, one of the main topics in each stop was access to visa appointments. And I also asked in my role with my consulting business here, how have other countries been faring? One of our partners in Nepal has told us as of February this year they are not recruiting for Canada anymore, and that their team had been so focused on Canada and Australia, UK, that they're now switching to the U.S. as opposed to Canada. So they have to educate themselves, and we're scheduling trainings for them and all that. So this is part of the evaluation process on in how we're looking at visa flows, is looking at these other countries. So the numbers are reflecting with, like for example, Australia. We've heard that they've just dropped a cap starting in 2025 of 270 million. I said 240, not million, 270,000. I think I said 240,000 earlier. But 270,000 is the cap of new international student visas issued in 2020, starting in 2025. So from January. That will be the rule. And that's the reason they're doing that is they've had, again, the capacity issues that we talked about. They've seen enrollments grow at universities by 50% since before the pandemic. And before that time, in the same time frame, universities enrollments were growing at 10% in the same, so the majority of those enrollments were on the international sides, in growth at least. And that's one of the other reasons the education minister in Australia has called for why the cuts are coming. Students are back, but also the quote unquote people seeking to exploit this industry to make a quick buck are back as well. So they've accused, the Australian government has accused some higher ed institutions of unethical behavior, including, quote unquote, accepting students without adequate language skills, setting subpar education standards, and enrolling people who intend to work instead of study. So those are some of the main reasons why the caps are now in place in Australia. So what that's led to is like for example, Nepal had been a major market for Australia. They are now facing record high visa rejection rates, where that they've had seen in the last 2 to 3 years a big increase in the number of Nepalis going to Australia. We're now seeing a 33% decline of student visas granted to Nepali students applying to Australia in 2023. So in 2023, only 11,000 students, Nepalis, were granted visas to study in Australia compared to 23,000 in 2023. So they've lost over 50% of their new students heading that way. So where are they going instead? The UK is one of those beneficiaries. They've seen their visa rates from Nepalis increase 63% in terms of the number of study visas issued. So we're seeing some very significant growth going away from Australia, going to UK. In one other case, we see an agency, a master agent aggregator going not at all to Canada, instead refocusing on the US. So yeah, in Nepal was very significant changes going on that way. We saw in Sri Lanka, my first time to that country, meeting with 4 different agencies that one of our partners had arranged for us. Each of them said, hey, we're starting to get questions about the U.S. market. We're seeing a move away from Australia, a move away from Canada, but UK still plays a very significant role in that country based on colonial history. But we're seeing an interest in knowing more about the United States. So we're seeing some very significant movement throughout the subcontinent in South Asia there's still that huge demand in India that is not being met in terms of visa appointments, but we've also seen a spike from some of our partners in Nepal, in India, have shared that visa issuance rates are down in India this year. Probably more visa appointments than there were last year, but higher visa rejection rates and big kind of dip in total numbers from a lot of the big players in India this year to the U.S. So that might be a temporary thing. It might be a long-term trend. But we also see India students are falling not just to the U.S., perhaps in Australia, but also to the U.K. that has seen so far this year 23% drop in Indian student visas granted. So we'll see what happens after the dust is settled from the fall enrollments, but we're really seeing a lot happening on this front and looking forward to continued evolution in what's going on. So that's all we have for you this week on the Midweek Roundup. We really wish you the very best as the new academic year is beginning across the country, and look forward to seeing you out on the road later this fall. As for all these things, we're grateful for your time. And on a personal note, just wanted to dedicate this issue to my brother, my younger brother who passed away this past weekend. Simon, I love you, and we'll see you again soon someday. Have a great week, everybody. Goodbye.